This is Chuck Rand. I'm a director at the Old Bristol Historical Society. We're in Pemaquid Harbor at the home of Robert Ives. It's October 20th, 2019. Also with me is videographer Russ Lane. Thank you for setting aside the time to do this.
Glad to.
Okay, what's your full name?
Robert Emil Ives.
And when and where were you born?
I was born on July 7th, 1946 in Mount Vernon, New York. And I lived there for about a day and a half. And I then moved to Bridgewater, Connecticut. My mother always went to Mount Vernon, New York to have all her 4 sons born. And she did that was because her father was an obstetrician and gynecologist. And it was a lot cheaper for her father to deliver the children than some other obstetrician. So she always went to Mount Vernon. And that's where I was born, in Mount Vernon, New York. Moved to Bridgewater, Connecticut after that, a day and a half later.
And what were the names of your parents and your siblings?
So my parents are Charles Libby Ives, my dad, and Elizabeth Ware Emil Ives. My brothers are Peter Bradbury Ives, Charles Libby Ives Jr., and my youngest brother, I'm number 3, and my youngest brother is Jonathan Williams Ives. I have 6 foster sisters, if you'd like to name.
Sure, yeah.
So my 6 foster sisters, who I don't remember 2 of them, but Catherine, Gloria, Beulah, Sandy, Dorothy, and young A. Lee.
What was your parents' religious background?
Wow. My mom's a Quaker, went to Swarthmore College. She came out of a Presbyterian background, but when she was at Swarthmore, she became a Quaker and was always a Quaker theologically, even though she married my dad, who was a Congregationalist and eventually would become the United Church of Christ. But my dad was raised and he was a minister in the Congregational Church.
And how was religion observed in your household?
Observed, not sure that's the right word.
Well,
I would say it was lived. It was just every aspect of our lives was kind of religious, spiritual, in the sense that every morning after breakfast we would gather for a little service, a worship service. My mother would play the piano. We would often sing a song, a hymn. My dad would read from the Bible, share a little bit about the meaning of that, and then a silent prayer in the Quaker tradition, and then off to school. All those types of things. All life revolved around youth groups, singing, the church itself, because my dad's a minister. My mom actually played the organ. She never went to Quaker meeting, but she was a Quaker through and through in her theology.
what do you remember about your grandparents, and who were they? Just the first generation back.
Yeah, so my grandfather, the obstetrician in Mount Vernon, New York, was again, just a very kind, gentle soul. I don't really remember too much about my grandmother. She was quite ill when I was growing up. She fell, she broke her hip, and she became an invalid. And my grandfather took care of her for probably about 15 years. She was in bed, and he took care of her in his retirement in that way. He delivered over 5,000 children and practiced up until he was almost 75 years of age. Again, just a kind, wonderful man, traveled all around the world. He loved geology in particular, but also just meeting people. My grandmother probably represents the biggest influence on my life. My parents die when I'm in high school. So I then go and live with my grandmother. and who's in Portland, Maine at the time.
What was her name?
Hilda Libby Ives. So her father is a Libby. He was the mayor of Portland, very prominent lawyer, mayor, president of the Board of Trustees at Bowdoin College for 20 years, just very interesting person. But in any event, I go and live with her, and she herself is a minister. So it's, again, she's the minister, my dad's a minister, my brothers are ministers, so it's kind of, in order to understand each other, you have to go to theological seminary.
What did you do with your siblings when you were growing up? What did you do for activities together?
We grew up again in this village in Bridgewater originally and Roxbury, two parishes that my dad was the minister of. Then I really grew up in Middlebury, Connecticut. And there's a big Village Green, a very typical kind of Connecticut town. Village Green, a girls' school called Westover School for Girls, across from where we lived in a parsonage. Our parsonage was, I think it was probably built around the 1740s. It was an old tavern. So we were raised in that. And what did we do? We played on the Village Green. Football, baseball, sports of all kinds. We played hockey on a pond just down the road from us. So I think our early lives revolved around sports, certainly music. We all played musical instruments. We all were involved in the church in terms of youth groups and activities. Again, singing choirs. Every spring we put on a play, usually Gilbert and Sullivan plays, in the church. So it was a very active, vigorous, I would call typical 50s type of life.
Do you remember any times when money was tight?
Money was always tight. That's, again, why I was born in Mount Vernon, New York. But, yeah, no, I think if I ever heard my parents arguing, which was very rare, but it was over money. And my mother kind of handled the money, and my dad always wondered why there wasn't more of it. Both, I might mention, had come from fairly wealthy families. Again, my grandmother, although she was a minister, her dad had been a mayor of Portland and had come from a lot of money that way. And my grandfather was a doctor, so he had money. But they had chosen to live in a very simple kind of way, through ministry, through the Quaker tradition as well. So if they had too much, they would give it away. If they didn't have enough, they kind of floundered a little bit in that way. So,
what kind of skills did you learn as a child, like cooking, carpentry, crafts, fishing, and who taught you?
Everything you said. We learned cooking from my mom. We learned carpentry from my dad. I built a boat when I was 9 years old with my dad from plans from Boy's Life magazine. The one thing, my parents had really very little, but the one thing that they did have was a cottage in the Berkshire Mountains. And it was like an old hotel. They bought it for a song. My grandfather had lent my mother the money to buy it because he was very concerned that they were working 7 days a week and had no vacations, and he helped them to buy this old kind of hotel. It was a cottage, but it had 8 bedrooms in it. It was enormous, on a lake called Lake Garfield. And the real reason my dad bought it was not just to have some time off and away from the ministry, but it was to teach his sons and stepdaughters there to learn carpentry. We rebuilt this whole place. So we put a new foundation in, we dug a septic system, we put a new roof on. We were always, summer vacation was working from 7:30 to 12:30. Then we could go and play. But we had to put in those 5 hours, 5 days a week during summer vacation, fixing this place, cutting trees, doing all kinds of activities. So it was there that I became a tool person and learned to love to rebuild boats as well as rebuild cottages and use tools.
This is when you started as a teenager, this, or even sooner?
No, it started when I was about 5 or 6 years of age.
Yeah, okay. Any special food you remember from your childhood?
Again, we're a fairly methodical family. I can't tell you exactly what we had, but we had on Monday the same meal every single day. I mean, every evening. And Tuesday the same meal. And it was always roast beef on Sunday because my parents after church would have guests in, so my mom always had a big roast beef. Then she would grind up all the meat, so we had some kind of hash or something on Monday evenings, and fish always on Fridays in respect for the Catholic tradition. My parents were very ecumenical, very open to any religious tradition as well. So they're very liberal, kind of leftist individuals. In fact, my dad didn't get any security clearance because he had to take an oath, a loyalty oath, during World War II, and he refused to take that loyalty oath because it said, "I pledge my allegiance only to my country," or something, and he would not accept that. He would only pledge his first allegiance to God.
What did you all do on Christmas or Thanksgiving or birthdays or other holidays?
I think they were kind of a fairly traditional one. We often would go down to my grandfather's. We lived about an hour and a half away from him. And we occasionally would take the train down to Mount Vernon, New York from Connecticut and always have a special Thanksgiving down there with my other mother's family in that area. So that was really fun. He always had treasure hunts and special games, and he was just a very creative and good with kids along that line, he was an obstetrician, not a pediatrician, but anyway. No, that was a lot of fun. And we'd always go to my grandmother's in the summertime, who of course was here in Maine. So my dad's a typical Mainer. Remember, probably the best exports we have are not lobsters and potatoes. Our best export has been our people, sadly. And my dad's a typical example, leaving the state of Maine, going to Connecticut, and then being a minister down in that area. So, anyway.
As a child, what was the largest city or town you remember visiting? And what was your impression?
Well, about 15 miles away is Waterbury, Connecticut, which was an industrial town, the brass center of the United States. So many of the people, or at least many of the executives of the big kind of plants in Waterbury, the brass factories there, would live up in Middlebury, which was way up high on a hill that way. So we would go to Waterbury for sometimes shopping and activities, occasionally a movie that way. My biggest amazement was in 1955, so I would have been about 8 or 9 years of age there, was a flood of the whole Naugatuck Valley and right down through the central part of Connecticut. And I remember going over to Waterbury and looking down on the hill there, and the whole thing was, it was just filled with water. I just couldn't believe it. And we, again, having a big place to stay, we had people from Waterbury living with us for over a year at that time. As we did after the Hungarian Revolution, we have probably about 6 or 7 Hungarians living with us for another couple of years along that line. My parents always believed in filling up their house with people.
Can you name the school you attended? This is as a child, grammar school and high school's a little later, but what was school like for you, and what did you like about it, or did you not like it, or what was hard about it? And
Well, I went to Mrs. Mont's nursery school, then Shepherdson Elementary School, Middlebury Memorial Grammar School, and then went away to a place called Deerfield Academy. My dad had lost his father when he was 2 years of age. He and his brother were sent off to Deerfield Academy because of that. And my dad loved it so much that he decided it would be good for his sons to also go to different schools. And they were paid for by my grandfather and my grandmother. So we went off in that kind of way. But school was school. It was, I probably, the thing that's most memorable is being the son of a minister. Probably began to feel that sense of extra pressure on me to conform to a certain lifestyle that I felt I didn't really want to uphold. And I remember probably in the 7th and 8th grades, one would call it rebellion, whether it was puberty, whether it was just rebellion against parents or the lifestyle that I was to live in as a son of a minister along that line. But I just was exploring rebellion. For example, I remember my shop teacher, who I loved, I don't even know why, I was chewing gum, and Mr. Platt asked me to take my gum out of my mouth. And I turned to him and said, "Make me." He said, "Robert, you will take that gum out." And I said, "No, I will not take it out." And he said to me to go down to the principal's office. I said, "No." And the sad reality was, after it all unplayed, I loved to play baseball. I love football, any kind of sports. We always loved it and everything. And the saddest thing for me was that because of that, the principal took me off the baseball team. That confirmed my rebellion once and for all. And I continued that for about 2 years, not living up to my academic ability, doing all different types of things as a now rebellious son. And I can remember to this day, sitting on the top of the stairs, listening to my mom and dad talking about me, saying things like, "What are we going to do with Robert?" And even to the point that my dad, who always wore a coat and tie until he went to bed, sitting me down with his coat and tie in the evening, and I had to sit in the chair opposite his desk. So he was in his chair, his desk, I was to sit in this very formal chair. And he turned to me and said, "Robert, I'm not sure what we're really going to be able to do with you. I am so disappointed." Well, nowadays it might not even, would just roll off a person, but that hit me right between the eyes. And I decided, literally from that point on, okay, it's time to change. And I'll show my dad that I can do it. And I changed at that particular point.
So, what were some of your, you had friends, I suppose.
Oh, yeah.
And did you have favorite subjects or favorite teachers, or how did that all mix in?
In elementary school, high school,
Yeah.
all of it. Yeah.
That's too much.
Yeah,
Remember?
well, I love my teachers. I think probably where I begin to really appreciate teachers is at Deerfield Academy, where they have it's in loco parentis. It's a place where, you're a part of a very interesting kind of community and very much a part of a family. And had I not been at Deerfield Academy when my parents died, I'm not sure how I would have really fared. But I think I fared all right because there were the teachers around and the headmaster and his wife, who I really loved very much. And it probably enabled me to get through the death of my parents because I was in this very stable kind of environment of sports, of academics. Now, having said all of this, no one, after my parents died, no one said anything to me whatsoever about the death of my parents. No classmate, no teacher, not even the headmaster. They said nothing, except for about 6 months later, my English teacher simply came to me, put his arm on my shoulder, and said, "Bobby, we are so proud of you," and then walked away. That was it. And in fact, I never talked about the death of my parents probably for 30 years. It was just the lifestyle. It wasn't as if they were negligent. It was just the way one did it back in the 50s and early 60s along that line. To the point that literally 10 years ago, I went to all my brothers and I said, you've got to come here to Maine. We've got to talk about our parents. And we were here, right where you're sitting here and out in the gazebo, for 3 straight days. We talked about our parents, about the death of our parents, how we went through it. We wept, we laughed, we cried, we laughed. I mean, it was the most cathartic experience I've ever gone through. And that's why, as I mentioned a little earlier, we began what we call now Ives and Wives. We always meet now twice a year to just share not just about my parents, but about our early life growing up, which we did not have an opportunity, because when they died, we all got separated. We all were at college or in different kinds of places, and we never had a chance to really come back together in that kind of important and fundamental way that a family needs in order to build a good, cohesive whole.
So Deerfield Academy was when you, from 18 to...
Deerfield Academy from 14 to 18.
14 to 18.
Yeah.
And we already covered that. Do you have any...
Then, yeah. So then I go from Deerfield Academy. I'm living then with my grandmother at that point in my late junior and early senior year. And then because Bowdoin is kind of a family college, I have Bowdoin tradition going back to 1830. A great-great-grandfather graduated 1860, 1864, 1898. So I'm the 5th generation of Bowdoin. And I wanted to come back to Maine because I was living there, and I just always loved Bowdoin, and so that's where I went to college.
So your senior year at Deerfield, you had already made plans to go to Bowdoin.
Yep. I made plans probably when I was 14 years of age.
Okay. During that time at Deerfield, did you have outside work, or did you have to do any
not at
Deerfield
itself. Everything was programmed and kind of outlined for exactly what you would have to do. In the summertime, yes, I always, from the time I was 14, since I was 5, I've been working at this cottage, but nevertheless, I take on formal jobs from about 14 on, working for a neighbor doing carpentry work, and then working at Howard. As soon as I'm 16, I started working at Howard Johnson's and Friendly Ice Cream. And I eventually made my way up to being assistant manager. This is just in the summertime. Assistant manager of Friendly Ice Cream.
And that was where?
Well, this actually was, at this point was in New Haven, Connecticut, and also in the Berkshires as well, in the town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts. The only benefit of being the not vice president, but the assistant manager of Howard Johnson, which I kind of went up to, was that I could count the money at the end of the day. I locked the door, and before I locked the door, I would test all 28 flavors to make sure they were okay for the people in the morning. I loved ice cream.
Does that include sherbet, or?
No, it was just ice cream for me.
I assume you began dating during Deerfield, and what kind of coeducational activities would you do on dates, or?
Dating was not at Deerfield Academy. It was an all-boys school.
Oh.
So I think we had 3 dances a year with other girls' schools in that way. So there was not dating. Having said that, I used to go out with one person in particular, a young woman named Prudence Wing from the Berkshires that we met in the summertime. And we continued to date until I was at Bowdoin College. So I went out with her for 4 years. And she was just a very remarkable person, a ballet dancer, a cello player, and just a very fascinating individual.
You mentioned earlier that you play a musical instrument or instruments. Mm-hmm. What is that?
Well, my parents, we had to, it's one of those kind of things. My parents were very organized, and they didn't ever say to us, would you like to play a musical instrument? They said, before you play the instrument of your choice, we will expect of you that you'll play the piano for 3 years. And then you can choose whatever instrument you like. That was their kind of method of doing things. They just kind of outlined it, and we just accepted it. It was that kind of era. So I played the piano for 3 years. I'd have a rather difficult time now playing because sometimes injuries happen. But nevertheless, I played the piano for 3 and then played the trombone from there on in.
Chopsticks can be harmful.
My oldest brother played the cello. My next brother, Charlie, played the trumpet. I'm the trombone. And my youngest brother, who started his 3 years playing the piano, never stopped. And he's been playing it now for 64 years.
So you're on to Bowdoin. What
Yep.
year was that?
So I start Bowdoin in 1965 and finish in 1969, and then stay on for a couple of years working in the admissions office. I was asked to work in the admissions office at that time. It was the, again, late 60s. Colleges were diversifying, and so I was asked to be the person to go out to kind of try to expand Bowdoin's population and diversity, to recruit African American students, Native American students, and I literally flew all over the United States interviewing students and speaking about Bowdoin to diverse different groups.
So getting back to your college days though, what did you study? What was your major study at Bowdoin?
My major was in art history, my minor was in religion. So I just loved art history. It was just wonderful to study history through the whole art realm. And I've always loved history, and this was a fascinating way to study history.
Were there any particular professors that you took a shining to?
Yeah, it was interesting. One who I had a little conflict with, because I remember starting a class with him. His name was Phil Beam, Philip C. Beam. Phil had been there for at least 40 years. But I remember asking him which African American artists we would be studying in a class that he was to teach called History of Art in America. And so I was fascinated with the class, and I went to him ahead of the class and I said, which African American artists will we be studying during this class? Because I'm really interested in African American art and that whole tradition. He said, well, Robert, actually, we're not going to be studying any black artists. They're not really worthy of the tradition and my class. And I said, Professor Beam, I said, this is a class about American history. I mean, this is a fundamental group within our history. Even if you don't feel they're worthy, at least if it's going to be a survey class, they should definitely be represented. And he turned to me and he said, well, maybe that's your opinion, but it's not mine. But if you would like to do a special kind of honors project and look into the history of African American art, and if you can be compelling and persuasive enough, from my perspective, I will be glad to offer the different artists who you share with me about, and I will add it to my art class. And you can do that if you would like. And indeed, that's what I did do, is a special honors kind of class. I did it in the history of African American art, and in my senior year, he proved to be honest and true. He incorporated many of the artists who I suggested into his art class.
And that lined you up for that job to recruit more African Americans.
It was helpful.
Yeah.
It might have been.
Yeah.
I actually, when I was asked to do it, I said to the director of admissions, who I adored, he was just a wonderful person, and I said to him, when he asked me to do this, I said, as much as I would love to do this, I can't do it for Bowdoin. He said, why? I said, because I'm not black. If you really want to recruit African American students, you have to have a black student. And he said to me something that has always stayed with me. He said, I can't do that. You see, Bowdoin has to be represented fairly. If I have a black student, of which we have very few at this point, these students will think there are black students at Bowdoin when there really were very, very few there. So that I would like you to do it to represent why we feel it's important for them to come to this college, but to let them know that they are coming to a very white New England college campus. And if they choose to do that, wonderful. But let's have fair representation. And indeed, that's why I did do it. My roommate, who was black, said, you must do it. And so I did take on that challenge. And the next person, becoming the Associate Director of Admissions, was a black person, so I was pleased about that.
When did they allow women to go to Bowdoin?
1971.
So that was after?
It was just as I was leaving, yeah.
Yeah.
But we, but we did. There were actually a number of women because we had had what we call the 10 college exchange. And so there were a lot of the 5 women's colleges, or at least 5, Smith and Mount Holyoke and some of the other women's colleges would send women to the other 5 male colleges, Williams, Amherst, Bowdoin, I forget which ones it was, Bates probably. We would have this 10 college exchange. So there were a lot of women, not a lot, but maybe 30 women on the college campus at that time. And then finally in 1971 we opened it up to women. There was a lot of protests at Bowdoin for that. In fact, one person, an alum, gave $20 million back in 1970, $20 million if Bowdoin would not go co-ed. So there was a lot of pressure not to, but indeed, one of the best things that ever happened to the college is when they opened it up and became a co-ed college.
So you were that outreach person for a while at Bowdoin, and then when did that end? And what happened to make it end?
Well, it ended in 1971. I mean, I failed at being an admissions officer for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I failed because I loved every bit of it. It was the most wonderful job I've ever had. I loved traveling around. I loved speaking about Bowdoin and everything. But what I could not do was to choose the students to come. When you have to eliminate 10 students for every one you pick, it was just an impossible job for me. I wanted to accept everyone. They all seemed so wonderful. And to eliminate individuals because of things like test scores or even grades, when I meet an individual one-on-one, they just seem so promising and exciting, and I just could not discern who should come and who shouldn't go. So I realized I was on, kind of an impossible situation for me. I would be torn apart every single April when we admitted some individuals and not all of them. So I realized this is not the job for me.
And then what happened?
Well, there are a lot of things that kind of complicated the whole story also. This is, again, war in Vietnam, 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. And when I graduated from Bowdoin, you also, if you didn't do something in particular, you had to go into the Army and be in Vietnam. If you had a 4F, you could get out on a physical deferment. If you went to medical school, you could get out of medical school. But I, at that point, applied for a conscientious objector status. There's a little long story. I try to abbreviate it, but I applied for a conscientious objector status and not go in. So you can go in as a medic in a non-combatant role, but I chose not to do that, not to have any involvement in the military whatsoever. Again, called a 2A, or anyway, I was a conscientious objector. So I applied for it and received it. So I was a conscientious objector. And when I was in the admissions office, that was my actual work. I couldn't believe it. But for some reason, my draft board accepted that as alternative service, working at Bowdoin College, recruiting African-American students. I was stunned, but anyway, that's what I did. But in my second year, I still felt a little guilty about doing social service work in that kind of way as a conscientious objector. And I felt that I probably should continue the protest against the war in Vietnam, Even more at this particular point, even though I was a conscience objector. So to continue my protest against the war, I handed my drafts 2A in to my draft board and said I cannot accept this actual deferment being a conscience objector. I'm giving you my draft card back and I will not accept it. Well, they took me to court and they said, they told me that they would have to punish me for handing my draft card back to them because you had to have it on you at all times. So they punished me, and they punished me by putting me in the Army. So I had a notice that I had to go for my physical, and I would be reporting to a certain Army barracks in that way. I then took them to court about it. You see, the Supreme Court, about 6 months before that, in 1968-9, somewhere in that time frame, had determined that no draft board could use the draft system as a means of punishing a registrant. In other words, by putting me in the Army, they were using the draft system to punish me. What they should have done was put me in jail, but they instead put me in the Army. So I just took them to court in Northampton, Massachusetts, where my draft board was. When my parents died, that's where I was living at Deerfield Academy, so my draft board was in Northampton, Massachusetts. So I took them to court, and I won it very quickly because it was a Supreme Court decision. They had disobeyed the Supreme Court in that way. So I was, at that point, a freed person. So I didn't have to fulfill my conscience objector kind of thing. I was free at that particular point, but at the end of 2 years at Bowdoin, I decided I would go to theological seminary. Again, in the tradition of all my family in that way. I had been wanting to go to Yale Divinity School or Union Theological Seminary, but I chose the University of Edinburgh because I decided at this point, being very upset about this country, what we were involved in, the war effort in that kind of way, which I did not believe in, I decided that I would leave the country, go to graduate school, step out of the United States because I was kind of angry and bitter about what we were doing. This would nurture me in this way, and then I could come back in refreshed and try to continue a positive spirit back here in the country. But, and it may get a little confusing, but in order to leave the country as a person who's now about 18, 19, 20, 21 years of age, I had to get permission from my draft board, who I had just defeated in a court case. Well, when I went to them and said, will you give me permission to leave this country to go to graduate school at the University of Edinburgh, they turned to me and said, no way, no. I said, well, why? They said, isn't something in the United States good enough for you, a draft dodger in this kind of way? I said, look, I said, I won this case fair and square with you, and I'm asking for permission to go to the University of Edinburgh for graduate work so that I can return in a few years to then continue my work and my labor here in the United States. They said, no, you cannot go. I said, well, here is my address at the University of Edinburgh. I'll be leaving anyways. And they said, if you leave, you'll never come back. You will become an illegal citizen and you will never come back to America. I said, look, I love this country. I don't agree with our policy in Vietnam and these situations, but if you feel that I'm not worthy of coming back, that's your decision. I would love to, but I will honor your decision and I will then no longer come back to America. I left. They said, as I walked out the door, you'll never come back to America. I said, that's your decision, not mine. And I walked out. And I did. I went to the University of Edinburgh, and I could not return to this country for 2 years. I was an illegal individual. So, for some reason, and this gets a little more complicated, again, I always wanted to come back. I had no, ill will against this country, just against what we were doing. I, for some reason, 2 years later, was sent by my draft board a new notice. I was reclassified 1H. To this day, I don't even know what it is.
That's what I was classified, 1H.
Really?
Yeah.
In any event, I was classified 1H, which meant that I could now come back to the country. I think it was a kind of amnesty, a beginning not of Jimmy Carter's general amnesty to everyone, but it was an amnesty for people who I had stayed in touch with them. I always told them where I was and everything, and they, in turn, eventually allowed me to come back in that way. So I was very grateful for that. I was planning on probably staying in Scotland, working there. I loved it where I was. I, again, spent 3 years in Edinburgh doing my graduate work there. But I also, during that time, had met my future wife.
I was wondering when that was going to happen.
So, in my
was...
second year at the University of Edinburgh, at the graduate school, I met a person named Ruth, who was from a place called Wiscasset, Maine. I had been from Brunswick and Portland. So we were not just the only two people at the University of Edinburgh from Maine, but from all of New England. And so we fell in love, and at the end of my second year, I was allowed to come back in to the United States. So I was very grateful for that. And at the end of my third year, Ruth and I were married here in Camden, Maine. So, and then we then begin working again here in Maine together.
And where did that work take you?
Well, Ruth had gone to the University of Maine, and we both graduated, in 1969. I from Bowdoin, she from Orono. And Ruth had always wanted to teach in a one-room schoolhouse in Maine. So she was a teacher. She wanted to teach on an island off the coast of Maine, and at that particular time, Monhegan Island was looking for a teacher of their one-room schoolhouse and a minister for the little community church.
And this was what year?
This would have been 1973. Yes, because I finished graduate school in 1973. So, as it ended up, we became the preacher-teachers of Monhegan Island. We both taught and we both ministered. Ruth had been, we met at the graduate school of theology there. Ruth was studying theology also. She didn't take a degree in theology, she just studied there for a year. So we ended up going to Monhegan Island and becoming the teachers and ministers of the little community church and one-room schoolhouse with 14 children in the school from kindergarten to 8th grade. So Ruth taught, well, I taught kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 8th grade. And Ruth taught the money middle. So,
and you did that for how long?
We just did it for 2 years. The expectation was we would only teach for 2 years, 1 or 2 years, because they wanted to have a variety of teachers always coming in so that the kids would have a more traditional type of education. And so at the end of 2 years, we said that we would be leaving. They said, well, why don't you stay more? And we said, because you told us we could only stay 2. And they said, well, we'd like to change our mind. We'd like you to do that. And we said, well, we think we'll be leaving. And they say, but we'll never find another preacher-teacher, to take over the island. I said, preacher-teachers are a dime a dozen. They're all over. They said, okay, we'll let you go if you can find us another preacher-teacher. I said, okay, I'll find you one. So I wrote to Yale Divinity School and said, an island 10 miles off the coast of Maine is looking for a preacher-teacher. Any candidates can apply into this, I told them, the school board. And within, I think, about 3 weeks, they had about 6 candidates. And they chose 2. The 2 came, and they picked one, and we were replaced by divinity students from Yale Divinity School.
And then where did you 2 head off?
Well, Ruth and I, at that point, so the church was under the kind of the umbrella, the auspices of an organization called the Maine Seacoast Mission. Maine Seacoast Missionary Society is the technical name. Started around 1902 by 2 Scottish ministers named Angus and Alexander MacDonald. So they had been ministers in Nova Scotia, they had vacationed in Maine, And as they were looking out on Cadillac Mountain to all the islands out there, Angus turned to Alexander and said, "What a nice parish out there." And it was they who began the Maine Seacoast mission. So all the islands were under kind of the rubric of the Maine Seacoast mission, and Manhegan was one of those islands. So in any event, they watched over all of, again, all of those islands. And the minister of the Sunbeam, that was the person who was in charge of all of the kind of little parishes there, turned to Ruth and me and said, "Look, you know, you've been working so hard on the island as the ministers and teachers, giving us all this time. Why don't you have a little vacation? There's an island called Loud's Island who needs a summer minister. Why don't you go over there for a month or two, have a little break, and then return to Manhegan in, you know, the wintertime to do your teaching and preaching?" So we said, "Oh, great." So we did. We went over to Loud's Island as the summer ministers and fell in love with that island. And indeed, we, during our second year, remember I said we knew we'd have to leave at that particular point because it was coming to an end. So we wrote to some of the people on the island asking if anyone would sell us a house or would sell us land, people who we had heard might be thinking of selling. So we wrote to one man named Eddie Poland from Loud's Island and said, would you ever sell us some land on Loud's Island? And we also wrote to another person named Hilda Libby. So Eddie Poland wrote to us and said, "Sure, I'll be glad to sell you any amount of land you want. I own up to about 150 acres. You can have 10, 20 acres. So I wrote back and said, "Well, 10 acres would be wonderful." And he said, "Well, sure, I'll be glad to sell you 10. Then I wrote him back again and said, "How much would you sell it for?" He wrote me right back and said, "For whatever you can afford." And I said, "Wow, that'd be wonderful." Then he wrote me right back and said, "No, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to sell you any land." And he said, "I'm not going to sell it to you because what I want you to do is take my house. You can live in my house for free for a whole year. And then if you want to buy 10 acres for whatever you can afford, do it that way." Well, we were stunned. I mean, this is our kind of guy. And so we decided that's how we would do it. But in the meantime, this Hilda Libby, who had never written back to us for 6 months, suddenly wrote to us and said to us that she was very sad and sorry that she had never responded to us, but that she was going through a divorce from her husband, Mark Libby, and she was going to return to her native country of Scotland, and she would be very willing to sell us her house for what she bought it for. And so we decided we would take her up on that, and we bought Hilda Libby's house on Loud's Island, and that's how we got onto the island.
And you would stay there for how long?
So we lived on Loud's Island for 2 years, 2 full years. So we moved from Manhegan. When we finished our time there, we moved over to Loud's Island. We were the first people to live on Loud's Island in 12 years. All the people had moved off in 1964, and we moved on in 1967, I think it was. Yeah. So remember, Loud's Island, well, to refresh your memory about the history there. So most of the people, after World War II, many of the men had gone off the island, had not come back either because they were killed or because they had seen electricity, amenities on the on the mainland, and chose not to return to the island. So that around 1945, the population had dwindled to maybe about 75 people or so. Then in 1962, the state stepped in and closed the one-room schoolhouse on Loud's Island. So there were 7 kids in the school, and those 7 kids represented 4 young families. So when the school closed, they were forced to go to Round Pond, New Harbor, and indeed, at that point, when the young families moved off, it left the older people there. They got very worried about being left alone on the island, and between 1962 and 1964, 11 different farms sold on Loud's Island for under $5,000, but it was sold to all summer people. And that was, 1964 was the last time anyone lived on Loud's Island year-round. So that when Ruth and I moved on in 1967, we were the first to move on in, as I say, 12 years that way.
You mean 1977?
1977, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then you began having kids at
Yes,
some point.
yes,
But I don't
we
know
did.
the chronology of that, so.
Okay, so we stay on the island again for 2 years. You know, we loved the island. It was just such a fantastic place. But we had no real income at that point, so we had to make money. So again, I basically took the little church over in Sheepscot. So every Saturday we would row off the island to serve the little church in Sheepscot. So that got us some money that way, but I lobstered, I clammed, I raked sea moss, I did carpentry, I built boats. You know, it was kind of a learning lesson of life there on the island. And so that's what we did for 2 years, all of those different jobs. But it was just two people. I mean, it was just Ruth and I from about, pretty much from about the 1st of October until the 1st of May. We were all alone. So, you know, you had to get along with your neighbor there as best you could, just because of the two people. So anyway, so that's what we did. We did all those things. And eventually, after 2 years, we were asked to come ashore because the minister in Round Pond and New Harbor died, Dr. John Wesley McKelvey. So when John Wesley McKelvey died, the bishop of the Methodist Church overseeing New Harbor and Round Pond called me, or didn't call me on the island because there's no electricity or telephones that go to the mainland, but I had a notice from Georgia Bell Lehman that they wanted to speak with me about the church. So I went ashore, I spoke to the bishop, and he asked me to serve in the churches of Round Pond and New Harbor as an interim minister. And I really didn't want to do it, and he didn't want to ask me to do it because I was not a Methodist minister. And he said the only real reason that he was asking me in the first place was because John Wesley McKelvey, before he died, had asked him to ask me to do it. And he said, I felt an obligation to ask you because of Dr. John Wesley McKelvey, who was a very important kind of figure. So in any event, he asked me, and I said I would be willing to do it. And it was very helpful because Ruth was 6 months pregnant at the time. And indeed, it would be a little bit better to have a child born in New Harbor, or at least Damariscotta, rather than on Lowndes Island.
And that was who?
Who was the bishop?
No, who was the child?
Oh, the child would be now Hilda Ives, my eldest daughter. Named for, of course, my grandmother, the minister.
And you had another child?
Actually, we had two other children.
Okay.
So it would be Hilda is the oldest, and then Jonathan is next, and then Hannah is the third.
Okay. I think I want now, when did the boat shop idea come into being?
Well, the boat shop actually was something that we really wanted to do on Lowndes Island. And that's where we really began that whole kind of process. But no one, you see, many of the year-round people, or the people who had been year-round people, had always said on Lowndes Island, they had always said to us that if anyone moved back to the island year-round, they would come back. They had loved the island so much that even though they had homes now in Round Pond and New Harbor, like the Pryors and the Giffords and many other individuals, they all said the same. If anyone ever moved back to the island year-round, we'll be the first to come. Well, after 2 years, they didn't come out and join us out there. And so we were a little discouraged by that because we were thinking that the whole island might become a community again and revive the church and the school and everything there. What a perfect place to build a community. But no one joined us. So indeed, we realized that, you know, we had hoped to have it out there and started out there, but with no people out there, we realized that it's like kind of being on Prairie Home, or not Prairie Home Companion, but like anyway, just living in a simple kind of place, that we needed to be in a community itself. So we then took this job as the ministers of the church. It lasted far longer than we ever anticipated. We thought it was going to be 3 months, and it ended up being almost 3 years. But that's when we began the boat shop, after that period.
Now, was that your idea?
Yeah, it was Ruth and my idea.
And who came up with the catchy title?
The Carpenters Boat Shop?
Yeah.
Well, that's a long story, but I had wanted to call the actual boat shop the Pemaquid Economic Ministry. And one of my initial board members, who was a minister named Ken Brooks, he asked me the same question you asked me. What do you want to call this new kind of ministry or community? And that's what I said. I'm going to call it the Pemaquid Economic Ministry. He said, that's ridiculous. That's just silly. You should call it the Carpenters Boat Shop. And I said, oh, that's pretty good. Yeah, we'll do that.
And what year was that?
That would have been 1979. Yeah, 78 or 79. So the boat shop begins when our term as the ministers concluded, as all Methodist ministers changed churches, the 3rd week of June. So the 3rd week of June was when we left the ministry there in New Harbor, the parsonage right there in New Harbor, and moved out to the farm on the Old County Road. Ed and Dot Penniman's chicken farm.
I think we're nearing the end here.
Okay.
But because you've covered a lot of my questions unexpectedly. I mean, it was great. It was great. This is a really general question at the end here.
Sure.
What has provided you with the greatest satisfaction in your life?
Wow.
It doesn't have to be one thing. I suppose it can be several, but it gives a better perspective of your thinking and your philosophy. And
well, my whole life has been so satisfying. And I've been very blessed to be able to do it with such wonderful people. And I've always been able to do the things I've always loved to do. I just have felt so blessed to be able to forge together and cobble together a life that included all the loves that I've had in life, from teaching and ministry and carpentry and boat building, and to then share all of these great loves of sailing, boat building, carpentry, teaching, ministry, and building of community, and to do it with such wonderful people. It has just been an remarkably fulfilling and meaningful kind of life. So I've been overwhelmed by that, to be able to do that type of thing.
how long did you manage the boat shop?
We began it in 1979, and Ruth and I ran it until she died, sadly, of course, in 2006 of a malignant brain tumor. And I wasn't sure if I could really go on after that. It was such a difficult kind of time.
Sure.
And but we did carry on, and I eventually, in 2000, shortly thereafter, met Phyllis, and she was on our board of directors at the boat shop. Interesting enough, it was Ruth who asked Phyllis to be on our board of directors, and she became a very important figure on the board of directors at the boat shop. And so, again, Ruth died in 2006, and 4 years later, Phyllis and I were married in 2010. And then I retired in 2012. So I'd been at the boat shop for 33 years.
And now are you a founding director of the OBHS?
Founding director?
Yeah, 2003 is when it began.
No. I didn't really come on until, no. I didn't come on until, gosh, I've only been on it maybe 6 years, something like that. Yeah. I don't even know who asked me to be on it, but anyways, again, I love history and everything. I might mention also that after 2012 that I retired, Phyllis and I went to Scotland for 3 years. We had 3 wonderful years, 3 months in Scotland. We wanted to get out of Bristol in order to let Kim Orr, who was the new director, take over so that she didn't have to be bothered by me being around in that type of way. So we went to Scotland and worked over at this community called Iona, an island off the west coast of Scotland. But then during that time, I was asked to be the director of religion and spiritual life at Bowdoin. So that suddenly became a whole new, wonderful aspect of life. So for 5 years, I was over as the director of religion at Bowdoin. And that was just such another very fulfilling and meaningful kind of vocation that I had never anticipated before. So I just felt very blessed to be able to do that. In fact, if we lived in Brunswick, I think I might still be doing it because it was so wonderful to be with those students. But I love being here, and now I'm back at the boat shop just volunteering and helping out in that kind of capacity.
But now we've got, and this is the final question,
Oh.
because I keep thinking of things. Where OBHS has embarked on a big crusade to preserve and stabilize the mill at Pemaquid Falls, as well as the retail store, Poole Brothers retail store, converting it into a archives, reading room, library. And you and Russ are the directors of this crusade. What are your hopes with this endeavor?
I think to continue on the way we've been forging it together at the present time, slowly, surely, with dedication and dignity and honor on behalf of the people of the town of Bristol. And I would like to see, again, us to have a full operating mill, not in the sense of actually producing lumber, but so that our children and our children's children can see the incredible heritage that our forefathers have done here in this town. So I'd love to see an actual replica of that original mill operating in that way, kind of like a real living history center. I'd love to see it become kind of a repository for all of the antiques and archives that we have from Native American tradition all the way through to 2019. And I'd love to see our retail building become a wonderful research center, history center, archive, again, where people can do genealogy, and just a thriving, vigorous, vital place with a lovely little park right between them. So that's my hope and dream.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of Old Bristol Historical Society for leading us, and also for this time that you've afforded us to talk with you about your life and activities.
Sorry, I hope it wasn't too boring.
No, thank you very much.